My name is Chris Yee, and I'm working on a 3D puzzle platformer called Nectar. In the game, you play as a potted sunflower with his bumblebee companion, using globs of nectar to grow plants and manipulate the world. I've been working on the game for about 6 months, and I've made a lot of progress. In this video, I'm going to talk about the different game mechanics I've developed so far. The obvious one is the nectar. So the way the nectar works is that everything surrounding the nectar within a certain radius is affected. So things will grow if they're within range of the nectar, and they'll shrink if they're out of range. And I intend on using this for growing platforms, revealing different things that are initially hidden from the player, creating walls that block the player or block objects. I'm going to use this to create all sorts of different puzzles. That's the intention, at least. And the player actually has the ability to emit an aura of nectar around the character. I don't know if I'm going to keep this in. It does look cool, but in a puzzle game I think it might make it too easy for the puzzles. I'll have to play around with it a little more. I haven't designed any puzzles yet, but just having the ability to activate nectar anywhere, in my mind, seems like it would make things too easy. I may keep it in, I may not. An extension of that is the Nectar Pulse ability. So currently the player has the ability to pulse out these spheres of nectar, and those spheres stay where they are for a certain amount of time, and they slowly shrink down until they disappear. This does have a little more potential for puzzles. You can place nectar auras in strategic spots, and then there would be some timing element to it, I guess, if you want to do things before the aura disappears. But again, I'm not sure if I'm keeping this in. I kept it in for now, just because I've already programmed it, but we'll see if I end up keeping it. Now for the nectar objects themselves, the first one is the nectar blob. So the nectar blob comes from these flowers. They spawn from the flower, they drop, and then eventually they shrink. The character can't really interact with these blobs at all, and that's intentional. These are mainly going to be a way to introduce the player to the nectar. It'll be the first form of nectar that you encounter, and they'll be placed in very specific spots to show you how the nectar is affecting the world. Now over time, the nectar blob shrinks, and as it shrinks, the range of the nectar also shrinks, and eventually the nectar blob disappears altogether. And then after a few seconds, another nectar blob spawns and drops, and the cycle repeats. I may experiment with different ways to let the player interact with these blobs, but they can't do it directly. My idea is that they would have to make things grow in order to divert the path of the blob. So for example, you can make a leaf grow under the blob so that instead of the blob hitting the ground, the blob slides off the edge of the leaf and goes down a hill. And then at the bottom of the hill, something can grow that wouldn't have grown before. So that's just an idea. I haven't really implemented that yet, but there's potential there for a type of puzzle. Another form of the nectar that I have is the nectar crystals. So these are a harder form of the nectar blob. In the world lore, the nectar blob has been harvested and they've been compacted into these nectar crystals to be used for different things. And these nectar crystals you can interact with. So you can pick them up, you can move them around. They start off inactive, and then you can activate them by bringing them into other nectar. So if there's a nectar blob around, you can bring the nectar crystal into the range of the nectar blob, and that'll activate the nectar crystal. And as you've noticed, these don't shrink like they do with the blobs. They're more permanent forms of nectar. And I plan on placing these around the levels. Some of them will be stationary, some of them you'll be able to pick up, but I have the option to, if I want just a permanent source of nectar within the level, I can have a stationary one attached to like a staff or something, and it's just permanently activated. So if you want to activate other ones, you can just bring your crystals to the permanent one, and that'll be your source of activation. And the last form of nectar that I have so far is what I'm calling the big nectar. Basically just a scaled up version of the nectar crystal, but they're very large. They're going to be things that you see far off in the distance, and things that you're going to want to activate. There'll be points of interest that you know you need to get to. And one of the reasons I wanted to have a form of big nectar is because I think one of the big draws of this game is the visual look of the grown world versus the not grown world. And I didn't want to just have the player constantly in the desolate area. I wanted big areas of vibrant color as well. So These big nectar crystals have a very big range for what they affect, and it allows the player to run around in a more pleasant setting, while also giving them a goal to reach. If you see one in the distance, you know you need to get there. It's also just eye-catching when you activate it, because all the leaves on the trees grow, everything lights up. It's a very pretty event. So that's the nectar. In terms of other things that I plan on using for puzzles, I'm going to have moving platforms, so if you haven't watched my other videos about nectar, this world is going to have robots in it, or at least it'll hint at robots from the past in a war they had with humans. But there will be robot technology left behind that will be part of the puzzles that you're solving. And one of those things is going to be moving platforms. I think moving platforms are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go over them too much. I haven't made them yet, but I can't really see them being an issue to make. What I have made are buttons, so I plan on the player being able to activate the platforms using buttons. So if you want the platform to move, you have to stand on the button or put an object on the button. And then to step back a level even further, the button has to have power. So I have generators with plugs, so you have to plug the generator into the button, and then the generator has to have power, and to do that I have power cells. So these power cells you plug into the generator has power and feeds power to the button has power, and then you can press the button and the platform would move, or you can plug the generator into other things too. This will be a puzzle mechanic, so you'll have to choose what you want to plug into and what you want to have power. That'll be for at least some of the puzzles. Probably in the earlier puzzles, I'll just have everything have power, so the button will just work from the beginning, and then I'll slowly introduce this generator power plug thing. I've still been playing around with the cable for the plug. I haven't found a solution that I'm completely happy with yet. The built-in cable component in Unreal doesn't really work the way I want it to. The collision is a little wonky, so I'm looking at other options. I might end up building my own cable component with physics constraints. We'll see. I think that does hit the performance a little bit, but I haven't tested it out yet. I might do that at some point. But one thing that I was running into with the cable was that no matter how far I carried the plug from the generator, the cable would just stretch infinitely. And I needed a way to limit that. So what I did was create a collision sphere around the generator that has a radius equal to the length that I want the cable to be. And then if the player is holding the plug and leaves that collision sphere, then the B attaches to a specific point that is always following the player but is on the surface of that collision sphere. So the cable length isn't what's limiting the movement, it's the B movement that's being limited to kind of simulate the cable length. And that's the solution I came up with. It's okay right now, but I'm hoping to maybe find a better solution later on with maybe a custom cable component. Another part of the robot technology will be lasers. So these lasers are also powered by the generators, but they don't have to be. Again, I'll probably introduce them as always having power at first, but I didn't want these lasers to be a bad thing. I didn't want them to damage the player or anything like that. I wanted them to be more constructive, so what I ended up doing was having the laser enhance the nectar. So if you point the laser at a nectar crystal, the range of that nectar crystal will increase. And then if you point it away, it'll shrink back to its original range. And this can add up too, so you can have multiple lasers pointing at a single nectar crystal, and it'll increase multiple times. And this opens up the possibility for even more puzzles, so I can have a single nectar crystal in the middle, and it can be just out of reach of a certain thing that I need to activate. And in order to do that, I need to find a way to point a laser at the nectar crystal. To add a layer of complexity to this, I added mirrors, so if there's not a direct line of sight from the laser to the nectar crystal, I can have a mirror that you can point the laser at, and it'll reflect, and you can use the mirror to reflect it into the nectar crystal. Now, for both the laser and the mirrors, in the beginning I found it difficult to actually aim the laser, and I didn't want this to be a precision thing. I wanted it to be easy to execute. That's been my approach with most things in this game. I want things to be easy to execute, and the challenge will come from figuring out how to solve the puzzle. But once you know the solution to the puzzle, it should be easy to execute. So to solve this aiming issue with the laser, I did two things. One is I made the nectar crystals a little bigger, which actually solved a different issue I was having because the nectar crystals were hard to find in the tall grass. But now that they're bigger, they're easier to see, and they're also easier to hit with the laser. And the second thing I did was I do a trace from the laser to detect anything that's close to where you're aiming, and if it detects anything, then it auto-snaps to that target. So I made it detect nectar crystals, and I made it detect mirrors, so you can easily lock onto these things without having to precision aim at them. It took a little while to actually figure out the math because it involved a lot of vector math, which is not my strong suit, but after a little bit of trial and error, I did get it to work, so I'm happy with the way it works right now. The laser also affects the big nectar. I may not be able to use that in puzzles, we'll see, maybe I will, but just for consistency's sake, it was pretty easy to implement, so I just implemented it anyway. And that's how the world works, so it makes sense to have it also work. One thing that I haven't done yet is make it affect the nectar blobs. And I'll have to see if I want to end up implementing that. It's a little more difficult because the nectar blobs are constantly shrinking, and figuring out how to make the range increase while it's shrinking is harder than I anticipated. It would make sense for it to work on the nectar blob though, although I don't really see myself using that in puzzles very often, just because they're always moving and it's pretty difficult to aim at a moving object. But currently the lasers don't affect the nectar blobs. So I already covered the power cells. They used to be batteries, but I changed them to power cells. They just look a little more visually interesting. And I have a whole bunch of other grabbable objects that you'll be able to use to push buttons and maybe do some physics puzzles with. I haven't made any physics puzzles yet, but that's a possibility. And again, with these grabbable objects, I wanted to make it easy to implement. So originally I had an aiming mechanic, so if you're holding an object and you want to place it down, currently the B is kind of just hovering around the character somewhat, and if you drop it, it might not drop exactly where you want it to drop. So I had an aiming mechanic that let you pick a precise location to drop the object. And this worked okay. I was able to get it to work, but it just added more controls and made it a little more complicated just to place an object. So instead I scrapped that and I set up predetermined hover points for the B. So if you're holding an object and it's interactable with the object you're holding, the B will just automatically fly over to that object and hover there. So like if there's a button and you're holding a rock, the bee will go over to the button, and then you can drop the rock and the rock will land directly on the button. You don't have to aim at all. And this just simplifies things and makes things easier to execute. It was actually fairly difficult to implement at first because I set it up in a way that didn't really make it easy at first. I actually ended up remaking a lot of the stuff just to make this hover mechanic a little easier because I knew I was going to use it on a lot of things. So we've covered the grabbable objects, we've covered the lasers, we've covered buttons, we've done the nectar. Next are the plants, because the nectar needs to grow some plants, and I wanted some unique plants that will actually help you platform and help you reach other places you wouldn't be able to reach, because that's the crux of what these puzzles are going to be. And I don't have that many plant ideas yet. I am looking for suggestions, so if you have ideas, put them in the comments. I have these leaf platforms that'll help you scale up walls. I also have these growing vines that act as an elevator. They can also act as a bridge. I don't know if I'm going to keep these vines in because they sort of serve the same purpose that some of the other plants do, but I may find a use for them. I have growing vine walls that I'm going to use as obstacles, and I was thinking of making like a vine maze sort of thing where it's harder to navigate if you're holding nectar, but if you let go of the nectar, it's a lot easier to pass. I also have these things I'm calling sprouts, which are basically just platforms that I can use to jump to higher places. So one thing with the sprouts that I noticed is that when trying to jump onto it, I would often hit my head on the bottom of the leaf, and it would just feel really bad. So how I solved this was I created an area under the leaf that detects whether the player is within that area or not. If the player is in that area, then there's no collision on the leaf for the player, and you can jump through the leaf from the bottom. And then once you're out of that area, the collision of the leaf reactivates and you can land on top. So this way you can jump through the bottom of the leaf and land on the top of the leaf, and there is no more hitting of the head on the leaf. It feels much better. I also plan on doing this for the the leaf platforms from the walls. I haven't done it yet, but it should be pretty easy to do. I basically just copied the same thing over from the sprout. I'm also going to have a rain mechanic, where the rain deactivates the nectar, and these sprouts will double in function as cover from the rain, so you'll be able to hide under the sprouts to protect your nectar. And then something that I've played around with, I haven't really figured out exactly how I want to do it, but I've tried a few things. I want to make a tightrope sort of thing. I currently have something you can walk across, but I want the tightrope to be able to double as a slingshot. I want some varied interaction between the plants and the nectar to make more interesting puzzles. So that's the plan right now, to make the tightrope double as a slingshot. And then one more mechanic that I haven't explored too much, but I am thinking I might want a level revolving around it, is the cell shading. It actually lights up dark areas that you wouldn't normally be able to see without the cell shading. And I was thinking of having some sort of cave level where everything is dark and hard to see, and if you have nectar activated, it lights up the cave and you can see things. Maybe grow some mushrooms that glow in the cave. That could look pretty cool. Again, this is just an early concept thing that's in my head. I haven't done any of it, but I think there's potential there for something. And then one last thing that's in the game that I haven't really done anything with is taking damage. Currently the player can take damage by running into this red block, and the character's health is reflected by the petals on the sunflower. So you know you're about to die if you only have one petal left. And I've been going back and forth as to whether I want to include this damage or not. It's a puzzle game, so I'm not really focused on enemies. I'm not going to make any enemies, but I might end up making some traps that you have to avoid. I'm still on the fence about that. It might be better to keep the character from taking damage and then you just can't die. And then the challenge comes from the puzzles, not from trying to not die. I could really go either way at this point. Again, I'm still just building all these tools so I have a full tool set to build puzzles. That's the main goal. I want to be able to build a lot of puzzles easily and quickly, which is why I'm spending so much time on all of these early things. I want to get them right from the beginning so that it doesn't cause issues later on. But that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this video. So if you want to follow the development of this game, subscribe and hit the bell, and you'll be notified of future videos. I also have a Steam page, so if you want to check that out, you can wishlist the game. And if you want to be part of the community, I have a Discord server. Thanks!